sticks.
All right.
Yeah.
Are you okay with light, Ken?
Fine.
You're good? You're good. Okay. Well, welcome to Malvern's Multiverse, and thank you so much for coming tonight. And I'm so pleased, privileged tonight to have as my guest Ken Fontenot. Ken has been a true patron of the store since we opened, and he was supportive of the store before I opened it. He was at some gatherings.
At Joe Hoppy's, for example,
Yeah,
one
Joe
time where
Hoppy's.
you kind of solicited folks to give some input as to what they thought might work for you, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So Ken's been around with the store with Malvern for a long time, and he's a well-respected author. He's a poet, and he's also a novelist, and he's a translator. He's let's see, I'm going to look at this so I'll get the title of your books right.
Okay.
Your poetry books are In the Kingdom of Birds and what is All My Animals and Stars? I don't know that.
That was done in the late '80s. That is one of my books. There was
that
a
one
20-year
award?
period between that one and the next one.
Wow.
That's kind of a
And
long
then-
time, but I wasn't quite ready until.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then was it Traces of
Traces of the.
Just a Trace.
Just a Trace of Moon.
Just a
That's
Trace
it,
of
yeah.
Moon, which
Yeah.
is kind of a
Yeah.
selected.
Yeah.
And then a book that I really love is your novel for Mr. Raindrinker, because I lived in New Orleans for 4 years, and Ken just brings New Orleans to life in that book. Such characters that are down there. And then also on top of that, Ken is a translator from the German, and it's just an amazing array of things. So we're going to have a little chat with Ken, and first thing I want to ask is, what got you into writing, and where do you feel what you're doing now, and what started you?
Good question. I started rather late. I was 21 years old, and at the time I was a senior at Tulane, which you went to Tulane too.
Yes.
And in 1970, the Vietnam War was going on, and it was at the peak. Just to give you an idea, during that spring of 1970, Nixon ordered the bombing of Cambodia, and also the Kent State students were killed by the National Guard. So all of the college campuses around the country were on edge.
Yes.
And in fact, it got so tense that at Tulane we didn't even have finals that semester. They just gave us the grade we had.
Wow.
So, but Nixon actually was burned in effigy by some students, and a Time photographer was there, and a picture of the Tulane students burning Nixon in effigy was on the cover of Time magazine, actually, just to let you know. Now that's sort of the downside of those days. What really impressed me was a poetry reading that was given that spring. Allen Ginsberg, 3 famous poets, Allen Ginsberg, Nikki Giovanni, and Denise Levertov. Ginsberg brought along his harmonium and chanted, and what he usually does is he recites William Blake's Little Lamb, and to the music, So that was kind of how I got started. Another piece of that story is that I was working my way through clinical depression at the time, and writing helped me kind of work out those feelings and get better, actually.
Okay.
So that's how I got started. I guess the segue would be maybe to talk about translation. My academic credentials are in German literature. I was thinking about this today, translation. Many years ago in the stacks of the PCL, I used to go through the library and see what translations of German poets were. Heine, Hölderlin, and usually they were scholarly academics that made an attempt to translate the poems. But not only is it so difficult to get the right rhymes or off rhymes is sometimes what you have to do in the piece, but what these scholars were missing is what's so important in poetry is tone, Joe.
Okay.
And it was totally lacking.
They were tone deaf.
They were tone deaf, and they couldn't bring that quality of tone over to the target language, which was English.
Mm-hmm.
So Rilke is another poet who comes to mind, and Rilke is actually probably read more in America in translation than he is in Germany right now.
Wow.
So two things happened with Rilke. About 1980, well, first of all, the poet Robert Lowell in the 60s said that Rilke was hopelessly stuck in the position of German, which would not let him be translated. But two poets proved him wrong. In 1980, a guy named Stephen Mitchell, who later went on to translate the Tao Te Ching, and that's another story about the money he got, the $130,000 advance he got for that. But he managed to bring over Rilke into English successfully,
Yeah.
and he got a lot of accolades for that. However, my favorite translation of Rilke is a guy who used to teach. He's probably a professor, a retired professor, or a professor emeritus. His name is Edward Snow, and he teaches at Rice, or he taught at Rice. And he brought out Rilke, his version of it. And, you know, Mallarmé said that a translation is never really finished, it's only abandoned. And he's probably right, but what Snow did in 2000, he brought out a translation, and then he was asked to do Rilke's more or less complete works. And he said in his introduction, I have felt free with more information I have on Rilke to make newer translations of the Duino elegies. So he actually redid all the elegies, which I thought was a tremendous sign of courage on his part, that as new information came in, he felt the need to redo it.
Okay.
So translation is tough, and I'm going to really quickly just take you through one of the things that is tough for a translator. And this poem was done by Jürgen Becker, who I've translated. This is another person who tried his hand at the translation. Becker was born in 1932, and he was about 10 years old when the Germans started bombing Great Britain with their bombers. And I'm going to read you just the first stanza. It's very short. It's called Chronicle, and it's in English. Today the sky is clear, a weather for bomber pilots. Soon, or maybe tomorrow, they'll take off the blossoms of the rhododendron. Well, there's a problem here. They, which in German is Sie, refers both to the bomber pilots and the rhododendrons, okay? So there's an ambiguity here. So the trick is to try and come up with a verb. The verb in German is aufbrechen, and that means two things. It means to set off on a journey intransitively, or it means to burst open. So you've got to find a verb which will work with both of those images, the bomber pilots and the rhododendrons. And he used the word take off. Well, We know that since Aufbrechen means to set out on a journey, the planes took off. But it's also not a bad way of talking about the rhododendrons, because they kind of take off too in the spring. You know, they kind of explode and go out like that.
Right.
But it must have taken him a long time to come out with something that would, this ambiguity in the translation, to try and make it doable.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of my little, and as a translator, I'm always faced with things like that, little problems. Puns are difficult to bring across, as you know.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, so you were talking about the poetry, we were talking about the novel for Mr. Raindrinker.
Right.
And for Mr. Raindrinker is actually a lyrical novel in more ways than one. There are several instances of complete poems that I put in the novel.
Yeah.
But there's what's called parataxis, and that is the use of short sentences to do a lyrical kind of feel to the novel. For example, I said I would maybe break in the text and say, where did the dead go? Why does the sun sink? Where are the victors of nature? Little things like that, which are very lyrical in there, and it's spread throughout the novel.
Okay.
So, and then the other thing I might say is from Whitman, I learned of the concept or the technique of listing, and so twice in the novel I use extended lists to make a point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know, my question, just a very basic question, is how autobiographical is the novel?
Well, you know, it's pretty autobiographical. There's some stuff that's made up. But I learned, you know, having been a German student, I've read interviews with post-war German writers, and they said, and it really hit a note with me, that they had to be truthful. Excuse me, let me take that off. That they had to be truthful. But there's this whole idea of telling falsehoods as opposed to truth. There's a lot of levels of that going on. And so you can still be truthful even though something's made up, because it's something that's possible.
Right.
So the truth of the novel is there. The scam at the end of the novel, the hold up in the grocery store, all that happened to me.
Okay.
But I tried to make it readable and not just sound like a journalist, but rather give it some literary validity.
Yeah, I totally think that works.
And I think it's funny. My friends think that they like the humor.
Yeah, I think
So,
it's very funny.
There was something that there's a story about it, Joe, that actually I was in Austin in 1974, and I was working at the Co-op, and I've come back and forth from Austin to New Orleans several times, and I was working at the Co-op, but right before the Co-op I had a job with 7-Eleven, and on Manor Road, right here where all these restaurants have now bloomed and have come into being, that area had a 7-Eleven, and from across the interstate I would bicycle every night from 4 to 11 when we closed, and work as a clerk at 7-Eleven. So one night I was there, and I had my back turned, and later they told me back then they had these safes that were in the ground, and you would have to make the drop of the money before you closed. So I made my drop, and I was just standing up, and I felt at the back of my head a piece of cold steel. And it was an amazing story, because I turned around, and it was the most beautiful
black man that I had ever seen in my whole life, and I figured he probably needed money for drugs. And he said, "White man, the faster you get that money out the register, the longer you're gonna live." And I want to tell you, I was not slow.
Not slow.
I was not slow. So in fact, it occurred to me later, actually, that I should have said, "Excuse me, sir, would you like some beer and cigarettes to go with the money? I'd be glad to give it to you, you know?" So that was a true story, and that little episode turns up in the novel.
Yeah, yeah. But, you know, the novel's wonderful and things like that, and your translations, but mainly I think you're known as a poet. And,
And that's what I work hardest on.
And, you know, you published the two books, and the one that I had not known, and it was an awesome book award.
Right.
But, so tell us a little bit about what you think about writing poetry, and then you can, you know, maybe give us a little reading.
A little reading, okay. Well, what do I think about poetry? Poetry, I have to say this. I was self-taught in poetry, as some are. I would encourage any young student who is serious about writing to take a creative writing program if they can, if it fits in with their monetary situation and their schedule, because it can save you a lot of time by shortcuts. I was self-taught, and along the way, from about 1970 through the early 70s, I took some wrong turns and I took some dead ends. I ran into some dead ends because I wasn't doing really what I was supposed to be, and there was some failure there. But I now believe that poetry can be taught, and it's very simple, really. You read something, and then you write something. You read something else, and then you write something else. And you show in your writing what you have learned from your reading. There's another problem, though, and that is experience. It's learning how to see. So you have to be constantly aware of looking for things, always, when you're out and about, stories with friends, any way you can grab onto some material. And I don't have a notebook with me, but I usually try to carry one to record little things that happen and to go from there to build a poem.
Sense.
Would you like to hear a couple
Please,
of poems?
please.
Okay.
Give us